Welcome to another edition of Masterclass, YouTube Masterclass. This is a Coursera class that you can audit, and you can take the audit for credits of your own if you take the final at the end of the course. It's a 16-week class. Well, not 16 weeks, 16 classes that you'll come to get for 4 units. And you have to watch all the classes, as boring as it gets. It's not really boring, but kind of is to some. And so you come and you watch, you audit all the classes, and then you get the credit. And you're going to college. You know how to do this. Like I would set it up for you, and say, well, you take a class last semester. You can take this class. Well, it's totally optional with the audit. You can take it any time, or any of the other classes at any time. You can take multiple classes at once. And they all apply to USC, Harvard, and Calarts. USC being where I have my master's in production, and I'm teaching for them because I had some units to add to my portfolio for teaching. So that's why I'm splitting the teaching into 3 different categories and only teaching one class at a time, because there's 3 different schools that you can get credit for, and eventually we'll have enough credits for you Harvard students to make a difference on how you, to prove that you studied film there is going to be a little difficult, but we'll get there. Because all you really have to do is have enough units to justify either a minor, which we'd have in like 3 years, enough classes for that, or a major. And I'm not going to go through the point scale or anything, and I'm not really going to talk much more about like the biases of what we do in Masterclass, because I mean, like, this is the 4th semester I've taught, fall 5th, counting summer of last year, and it's going into the 3rd year, and we're almost to the 3rd year of Masterclass, and it's been happening really fast, and we've all been enjoying it, and I think that we've all got a lot out of it. The film criticism classes were successful, the Griffith class and the special effects class, but now we're talking about Quentin Tarantino, and I've got the magic flute in the background, but you can barely hear it. It's like seeping through the airwaves. So if you like the magic flute, here you go. Quentin Tarantino, when I talk about the life and films of Quentin Tarantino, I think all of us have a familiar attitude about what we think about him. And anyway, like, all of us have a familiar archetype with what we see as his kind of hero director. And it's interesting because nowadays, within the top like 40 of the directors of the Directors Guild are like these superstars, and they're like these they have super abilities. And I hate to be the one to say that they have super abilities and had to have like crossed all these dangers and had to have come upon it, but you can see where even in their movies they've come upon the danger, and they've come upon the turmoil of being a director that's a superhero. And it like kind of reminds me of that movie Hancock, where he has to drink to get his superpower, and yet he's crashing into everything because his like that kind of reminds me of how we think of directors, like just that they party all the time, and they set up the shot sometime at the party and get the exact shot they need and then leave. And it seems to me like as emerging directors and everything else, you have to gain superpowers as you go. But I remember Quentin Tarantino on his show that he had before Reservoir Dogs came out, and he was a critic kind of at this. He was in this office, and he was trying to get some production work done, mainly Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, his first 2 films. And he had done some short films at NYU. He'd done college. He'd shot the works, and when his TV program came on, I remember talking in Masterclass about how he was teaching us how to program a remote, and it was cool because he was all about the contrast. And then he taught about things like John Ford, and we talked a little bit about John Ford and how he had John Ford's glass eye in a little case behind his desk. And we don't really have to get into intimate details like that to discover what we think of him, and we know of him as a superhero. Like, you hear these stories every once in a while that he's like in trouble and he got into some shiznit and then he got out of it, and you don't really hear the details, and you're just like, well, everybody likes him because he's the director that everybody remembers from all this that's blown over from the 90s and everything. And you got to understand, his most recent film is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I think that pretty much sums up not only his career but everybody's career that kind of happened from the 90s on in cinema, and yet it was blended with the 60s, and it's brilliant. We'll get into that film later. We've got all the films for once. We've got all the films from the director. It's not like Griffith where they're still putting the films together and they're still trying to find them. But I will say this about putting films together, and Tarantino does this too, and I think every release of a film is minutely different than every other release. Like, especially now with AI characteristics in the film, like every film that's released is minutely different than the other film. And I mean on like digital video and like DVD and everything, because uh not because of any other reason, but because the editor and the way it's recorded and the way it's brought back and the mathematics of it all and how it ends up laying on the track. A few seconds may differ each film, not the time wise, but the scenes could be different too, and that's why you got to watch films closely. If you've seen it a bunch of times, you might watch it again. One thing that cinema also does, and Tarantino does this too, is redirect your attention the second time through. You can notice certain cues on the way in on the first time that you're not really watching for, but on the second time through, you're watching for it, so you're going to face all the cues for the second time through, and good directors can get you through like hundreds of viewings of their own film. It's hard to explain how that happens, but it seems like a different movie because your attention is directed in different ways. But it's also a sleight of hand trick to get you through the first time through, where all the real blazing hypnosis, is. When we talked about classical cinema and how it's like this romantic, everything, the theme gets narrowed in and there's always closure. And one way you can tell the postmodern and modern films is there's not much closure, there's not much intro. It just kind of gets with the film and goes for it. And I mean, that's what I like about Quentin Tarantino's first film, and that's what we'll talk a little bit about today, and that's Reservoir Dogs. Now, Reservoir Dogs is interesting because it's got that "and then there were none" play characteristic of Agatha Christie, which is the same thing that, like, the movie, for instance, Murder by Death by Neil Simon has the "and then there were none" factor. It's like a play in a movie where everybody's going to die and everybody's taking each other out, and they're minimalizing it down to the fact that like each one of them is going after each other and taking each other down. Now, what's cool about Reservoir Dogs is you can never know who's bad or who's good. There's no way to tell, and the cast is amazing. I mean, it's got we got here Harvey Keitel, Tim Roth, Chris Penn, Steve Buscemi, Lawrence Tierney, and Michael Madsen. I mean, great cast for your debut film. And I think he was going around New York and he done some NYU films. And this is kind of an NYU film, Reservoir Dogs. It started out probably as an NYU film, and he had already thought about the gangster genre and how Martin Scorsese and Brian De Palma kind of brought that gangster genre to a golden era in the 90s, and then he came along in 93, Tarantino. Now, he'd written a dozen scripts. And a lot of them had gone through, like, for instance, True Romance, From Dusk Till Dawn, and all these were coming out around the same time. And he had also written Girl 6. I think that's a Spike Lee movie, but it's strange how it has some Tarantino script in it, and he's even in that one. So he had been in the independent film industry for a few years and had given us some really valuable scripts. There's more. We'll go over that in this class, all the scripts that he wrote. But Natural Born Killers is another one, too, that he wrote the script for, and then later Oliver Stone and his friends went back and wrote the way they wanted it. But the story credit still goes to Quentin Tarantino on Natural Born Killers. And so Reservoir Dogs was coming out around the same time because they just want to get into movies. He's talking in his show about how he can't wait to actually break the big time, and he's got these actors lined up, and it's going to be good, and we're going to have to see it. And then we don't hear from him for a couple of years, or like from a year, and then we realize we're watching this all after the fact, that Reservoir Dogs came out in 93. So we're all kids, And I'm not saying that these are old movies. These are recent movies. We still consider this contemporary Hollywood. And contemporary Hollywood and the gangster genre got really gritty in the 70s with Chinatown, but even wilder and crazier with Goodfellas in the 90s. And then there's Godfather, which we all know revolutionized the gangster genre. So now we've got another contender, and that's Quentin Tarantino, and he's got this movie Reservoir Dogs. So now we don't know if they're bad or good, right? We don't know if their good characteristics overtake their good characteristics, and or their bad characteristics, but let's put it this way: nobody knows who's on whose side. Whether it's good or evil or all evil, nobody knows who's on each other's side. And they're all like doing this job, and it's like a bank job. They're like gonna go knock over a bank and like hold it up with guns and like take all the money and run. And they have a couple of those to do. And they're like figuring out gangster things. Well, one thing about the colloquialisms and the way they talk at the beginning in the restaurant after they've done their whole little green bag like march out, and that march out's cool. They do those a lot, like where they show all the characters of the movie kind of walking forward, and that all came from the Reservoir Dogs shot. It's like this long take of them walking out, and then it'll establish all of them together, and then it'll edit to their head, like, or just their bust, or just like just them in the picture, and it's like they're all in slow mo. And here we have that slow motion idea of like having fun with what you're doing, like as an editor or as a filmmaker. Because if you turn the camera real fast and it's a film camera, then it'll look slower when you play back. If you turn it faster than 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second and on, then it's going to slow the progress down. And the thing is it's not really the progress, it's the shot, because, or the picture that you see from the camera, because they're all in their suits, they're all walking forward. Quentin Tarantino himself is in the movie, and yet they're going slow-mo, and they're setting this ideal shot of an introduction. And it's one of the most brilliant introductions I've ever seen in a Hollywood career. I mean, like the fact that the camera is moving from character to character, they're still walking slow-mo, and it's all edited seamlessly, right? It's well-timed edited shots because it's all match on action. And he makes a really difficult shot to get look really easy, and that's what he's doing with these shots. Is they're really complex, they're really drawn out, they're really like, but there's no dialogue in that scene. It's just music. You just hear the music, little green bag, and it's like you kind of, the music and image just fuses into this big movie that you're seeing, but it's also like an indie film, but it's so gritty and urbane. You can like feel the sidewalk as they walk on it in the heat of the city. And so now they're in the restaurant and they're talking to each other, and like Harvey Keitel saying, they're all saying things that are kind of offensive. Like there's a lot of cussing in Tarantino, and the dialogue is very full of F-bombs and every word you could think of. But one thing I'll mention about that is it's never usually done in an offensive way, really, because it is done intentionally in offensive ways, like later in Django Unchained, for instance. But in Reservoir Dogs, it's just small talk, but it's also emphasizing what they say between the F words as these, like, really brilliant plans. And this is also progress for the storyline. And the dialogue will progress the storyline by having these, like, jokes and anecdotes and things that fit around the dialogue, like in a Hitchcock way almost. It's like entertain them with the expressive dialogue, like the metaphors and the things they're talking about, like whether it's Madonna or anything, they might mention later in the film, but it's kind of insignificant over how the story is being told, regardless of what information the characters are giving, especially when they're cussing, because they're not trying to be offensive, really. That's just the way they talk. And I think that's one problem we have with Tarantino is we always think, oh, that's offensive. And really, people do talk that way. So then you get into that whole imitation of life thing. And you're like, well, if people talk that way, does that mean we should talk that way in the movies? I don't know. Was that the subject of a movie? Because if it was the subject of a movie, then you'd have to talk that way. Now, I'm not letting off the hook like any later expressions of tendencies of bitterness over the fact that there's always these N-words in these movies, but I think that all comes to a head politically with Django Unchained, because there's so many N-words that, like, by the end of it, nobody wants to say the N-word or hear it again. I mean, it's like, and that's the point, is the bad guys got it this time, and these guys in Reservoir Dogs, they're ambiguous. They're morally ambiguous. That means they have good characteristics when they're evil and bad characteristics when they're good, and so it's like they're these mixed characters, and they're really complex. Now, after the restaurant scene, we start getting to these shots that are like sitting up against a wall, kind of like in here, like up against a wall, and it'd be flat in the background and like kind of a wooden background, and it's kind of halfway pushed up, and there's these interviews going on with like this dawn of their gangsters, and I don't remember exactly who that was, but that might have been Lawrence Tierney. unless I'm way off on that. But one thing I should remember too is that I think this was when Tarantino was with Lawrence Bender. Yeah, Lawrence Bender was his producer on the Pulp Fiction, and I don't. Yeah, it looks like he went on to Jackie Brown too. Those are like the Lawrence Bender sessions, man. And I don't remember what all happened with that, but I know that they stopped working together eventually. But that Lawrence Bender was bringing out these big productions for Tarantino personally because he'd seen some of the screenplays he'd written for Oliver Stone, and also that was all happening at the same time because you got to realize he was still script doctoring and still handing out scripts while he was making these movies. And one thing that's also strange is that he was making part of his last film around this time of Reservoir Dogs all the way down to then. That's kind of confusing because you're like, well, if he's working on all those movies at once, but he's just getting certain scenes for like Grindhouse and whatnot in the early days that he could get captured of, and then go back and put it in like when you're back to making the movie. That's a really hard trick to do, but that does occur here. And then that Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction were being made at the same time. There was some overlap, like towards the end of Reservoir Dogs in 1992. There was already some overlap with Pulp Fiction. That there were earlier versions, that there were different versions of the same movie happens a lot here, not just because of distribution on DVD and how that slides off the center. I mean, it's also the distribution of Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs are one reason it changes, but the other reason it changes is because the artistic quality of the film and where it's delivered and where you see it on the internet or whatever is different compared to the rules of every media simulcast on a computer. And most of those rules are time zone allotted, so there's probably like 12 versions of every Hollywood film, and that's the 12 time zones. Each time zone has their own version, and I guess each time zone likes editing done in a certain way. I mean, there's a whole study for you, the time zones and how they affect how movies versions come out and what they say in them, you know. So, let me just get on with this. And then there were none factors, like where there's like 10 of them in a room, and then they're slowly, having this murder mystery, but people are banging each other off. And that's one of the things that gets so hard about Reservoir Dogs to keep track of, is who's on whose side, because really it's all against all. It's every man for himself is basically this idea. But that they're, for instance, earlier in the movie it shows a scene from towards the end, and that's one thing I love about Tarantino is anachronisms within the film, like where he has these anachronistic shot of like Tim Roth dying in this back seat. He's like bleeding and he's falling over and he's screaming, and then in the front seat you have Harvey Keitel telling him to stay alive, stay effing alive, don't effing die on me, man. And he's got this gun and he's about to kill him because he thinks he's suffering so hard. And then, so they drive him back to this warehouse, and then the rest of the movie is pretty much this theatrical experience, like play theater almost, inside this warehouse, where sometimes you see like silhouettes of these guys against the garage when it comes open and closes, and you see them come in. There's another song that's used, contrapuntal, because I like that too about these films. You'll see that there are a lot of contrapuntal sounds. The self-reflexiveness comes out in the editing and the versions and the contrapuntal sounds and the strange violent scenes. But what the contrapuntal is it'll play a song, and then the exact shot or scene that the song is playing over will be the exact opposite of what's in the scene. So it's like Stuck in the Middle with You plays, and that's what's on the soundtrack, and it's kind of jazzy and upbeat. But then like this dude's getting his ear cut off, like Michael Madsen's cutting off Tim Roth's ear or whatever. And I don't even know if I had the cast right there, but the ear gets blinked off, and then you're like, well, that didn't sound. It really gives you this different feeling for the first time in a long time that we haven't seen since Jean-Luc Godard. And I mean, Jean-Luc Godard is really important for the Tarantino class, because Tarantino always really loved the way he could make a lot of fantastic images. Like even the slow-mo that he figured out comes from the Truffaut-Godard paradigm of the French New Wave. And I'm sure that Tarantino, when he was at school at NYU, he studied things like, and in LA when he went to different schools like LA Film School and everything, he was probably studying that the French New Wavers did a contrapuntal sound. They did the jump cuts everywhere. They did the story told out of order. They used to do those things all the time, but just not as stylish as a Hollywood film would come along and intercept like these codes and bring them to the postmodern era. So they're like modern with Truffaut and Godard. You sense their despair. But it's postmodern in Tarantino because we're selling an idea of like the hardest gangsters in LA. Hold on, and so I'm not saying it's really selling either. It's more like presenting the way the art form is going to entertain us best. And I know that's kind of rough generalities, but stick with me because there's cartoon realities like Kubrick, like where you get in Pulp Fiction and they go to this place for burgers and it's like this old school like 1950s restaurant and everybody's from the movies in the 50s when they walk through it. And so I think the cartoon realities that you see like earlier in Full Metal Jacket by Stanley Kubrick are similar in the way it kind of shapes the person in this whole Vietnam setting. And Apocalypse Now really does that too, where you see like one individual character and then you see everything he has to face, which is this war that's way bigger than him. So I mean, I know Tarantino loves those movies I was mentioning, like Godfather and Pierre Le Fou and Breathless is the one from the 1959 that really changed the French New Wave era. It was right when the French New Wave came in with Hiroshima Mon Amour and Truffaut's 400 Blows, and Godard's Breathless is in black and white. And I think Reservoir Dogs was originally intended to be in black and white. And I've actually seen a black and white version, but don't ask me how I used to get copies of all that. I used to run a video store or whatever. And when I ran the video store, I was stealing the idea that like Rio Bravo is all we have to talk about in the video store. And that was like some joke that The Onion even used on Tarantino for his glory days, or when he talked about, movies and talked about Rio Bravo back in the day because that was his true golden era. And that's funny, but consider that he did work at a video store when he could no longer go to film school, and the video store taught him everything he needed. Probably why he has so many versions of his different versions of his films. And by that I mean there's director's cuts, there's special editions, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's usually an upgrade on the film and the film stock and the film medium to be a better copy. This copy of Reservoir Dogs, and you can see here this is a threesome disc. It's got Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Jackie Brown. I've got Pulp Fiction over there too, somewhere. There's another copy of Pulp Fiction on the shelf, and we can look through these, at any time. I didn't bring all the movies over, but I have this book, and we're going to study it. And if you could buy it, it'd be really great. I'm kind of requiring that this class buys this book. It's called Pulp Fiction by Dana Poland, and it's not the script. It's about the movie critical thinking skills applied to Pulp Fiction, and it'll have these examples in it of like how it uses certain pictorial examples of things that look completely perfect or completely desirable, and then kind of shift around and watch it get like weaved into this world of pain and disaster and reverses of fortune. I mean, the reverses of fortune in Pulp Fiction slay me, because if you put it all back in order, there'd be like 13 reversals of fortune, where the cast is all, and there's lots of those in Reservoir Dogs too, where it's like the cast is all going one way to progress, and now they're going against that way and going opposite, and now something else happens to cause them to go against it and opposite that, So you start to break down the imagery from Reservoir Dogs. It's this very gritty, urbane, like gangster film. You see these guys walking around. They're shooting each other. They're cutting each other's ear off. They're beating each other up. They all don't know who has the access to the money from the bank robbery, and nobody really knows. Some of them might be FBI agents. We're kind of suspicious of that. The ending's totally ambiguous. I'm not going to spoiler alert it, but we're kind of talking in this class. It's important. There's always a smoking gun, and the smoking gun in this one is the money, of course, because they all want. It's the MacGuffin, the MacGuffin's the thing that moves the story forward, and it isn't really what the story's about, but everybody's focused on it because it's the shifting sleight of hand trick, the smoking gun, and at the end, there's always an ambiguous ending, ironic, and that's what I like about that's the Kubrickian ending, because the Kubrickian ending is the three-way irony, like where the world blows up in Doctor Strangelove. I mean, that's the three-way irony, because like nobody saw that, none of the characters saw that coming, and they did so see it coming. They said it was going to happen at any time, and then it did happen at any time, and we're all left like, whoa, that was ironic. So the other irony, there's other ironies to Kubrick, but I won't get into that. But I think that Tarantino is a little nicer to us in terms of cynicism. Like Tarantino will cast a joke when air be cynical, and I know there's cynicism that gets you by as a gangster, just like every way you can play it, and they do that, but by less cynical than Kubrick, that doesn't take much because his films end so robotically sterile, and everything seems so destroyed by the post-apocalypse or something, and that's kind of the way that Tarantino will do it, the apocalyptic to post-apocalyptic ending. I mean, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is kind of like Hollywood Apocalypse Now, it's like, it's all this one big, giant, seamy, beautiful, destructive torture of the world, but it's like basically Brad Pitt just driving around in his car. Like that's how cool it is. I mean, it's just like him. It's like this shot, and I love how Tarantino frames like inside the car and around the car because those are difficult shots to get. And in Reservoir Dogs, he's already kind of got that Dusk Till Dawn plan that Robert Rodriguez is one of his co-directors. We'll get into too, and he's a really great director himself. And they show the car, and it's like you can see the side of it, and you see the girl appear in the trunk, and she's like, the colors will swish and open up, and in Reservoir Dogs it's kind of the same thing. You feel like you're leaning out of the car or something, and yet you see through. You're in the car, and yet you can tell he built like a camera off the car to film that shot. I mean, these shots are so technically crafted that it's really easy to see how you could see these directors as superheroes in today because the scenes are so meticulously crafted. And I'm not just saying as a craftsman, I'm saying that Tarantino's poetry comes across just from his ability to remember how to do functions that he learned from the French New Wave and classical Hollywood. The gangster films of classical Hollywood informed these films like Public Enemy and Little Caesar, Scarface, the original Scarface with Paul Newman by Howard Hawks. And he saw these films in his video store and got really hooked on them. Well, Rio Bravo is one to import great information on us because despite the Onion's joke, like Rio Bravo has John Wayne and I'm trying to remember Dean Martin and Ricky Nelson. And they're all in this prison cell. Sorry, that took me to remember to call. They're all in this prison cell, and they have to protect this criminal by locking him up. But these guys are coming to kill him, and that's how they lock him up. And they will have a gunfight with anyone that comes in to try and break this guy out of jail or kill him. So if it's this gang breaking him out, he's in jail. But if it's the other gang breaking him out, they're going to kill him. So they're guarding this like capture the flag holy grail thing that's bringing everybody there, but then they have to go out, kill all the dudes, and come back and keep protecting him. And it has somewhat of a resolved ending, but it's like Howard Hawks again. And this is really influential not only to the color design, like the Rebel Without a Cause color design from the 50s that totally latches on to the cinematography of the movies of Quentin Tarantino. And the Rio Bravo paradigm is all seen throughout because even in Reservoir Dogs, you see this Rio Bravo thing where they're all protecting each other, or the guy that doesn't want to die, or they all know they've got to die, but they're still protecting one guy because somehow he has immunity and we never find out why. And it's the Rio Bravo factor. They're all in there about to gun each other down if they can't get the money. And of course, somewhere in Rio Bravo there was a stash of money, but we know that these gangster guys are also realistic looking because they're all in business suits. There's a really good meticulous costume design. I mean, this name, Reservoir Dogs, really has a brand on it. I mean, it was a blockbuster when it came out. It did like 98 million at the box office, which in today's terms would be like 10 times as much. I mean, it did so much money at the box office, it was ridiculous. People like me were going back to see it like 5 or 6 times. And I went with a friend from high school, Matt McAllister, and we went to the Reservoir Dogs like 6 times in a week one time. We just kept going back and kept going back. And we were talking about it on this radio show we had. And I was like, well, I don't know. Like this new Quentin Tarantino thing, I've been watching him on TV a lot on HBO, and I'm ready for it, man. I'm ready for it. We weren't ready for that. It left us blistering. It left us covered in, thinking we were covered in blood. It left us completely. We would bring coffee in so we could have coffee at the same time, as the guy on film. Because when you're drinking coffee or smoking cigarettes at the same time as the guy on film, you're totally going to love the movie. You'll give it an A+. I mean, I'm telling you that as a critic because you're enjoying what they're enjoying and they're all enjoying it together, right? But that's only one point of the movie, and the cinema of coolness and the cinema of loneliness in these films is kind of on the same level, because the cinema of coolness is like everybody knows you're so cool that you can do anything. But the loneliness is, but you're going to have to do it alone because I've got other things that I'm cool about. Like I've got other ways of being cool and you've got your ways of being cool, but we're all going to have to do it alone. And really, we're cool enough to do it alone, but that it'll work out our way. Well, we're cool enough for that to happen. And that isn't just coolness, because, I mean, you look at the idea of, like, coolness as being kind of nerdy, like, I'm going to be cool today, or I'm going to stay with the cool kids. But we're talking about cool in terms of Rebel Without a Cause cool. Like, back to Rebel Without a Cause, because you see that in this Nicholas Ray film, there's all these bright, vivid, like, reds and vivid blue color on the cars, and the red on the wall, and it's just like the red jacket, that he's wearing. And Rebel Without a Cause is the type of cool we're talking about, like where you get the 50s restaurant in Pulp Fiction, and it's the idea that, like, we're so cool, but on the underside we really are lonely because we don't know how this works. We're facing death constantly. Like, his characters are always facing death. Like, I remember one time when Quentin Tarantino came on NBC and he said that the Friends ending was going to be directed by him, and it's with 27 dudes, and they all, or the pilot was going to be by him, and it was 27 dudes, and they all kill each other, and they narrow it down to like 6. I'm like, well, I don't think that really happened, but okay. But it might have, that there might be a secret Friends episode that none of us know about where Tarantino took them all on the Reservoir Dogs track. But there's so much more to talk about with this film. I mean, one thing that's cool about it is that they keep using soundtrack material, and that again goes back to that Rebel Without a Cause, that, like, I'm a badass, but I'm heading for my certain death kind of movie. And it's like they're above everything in terms of they get the pop culture, they get the references to gangster movies, they get the music designed to be these rock and roll albums. And the aesthetics of having rock and roll in your movie is very contextualized by the appropriation. The appropriation is how you play the music along to the scene. Usually that means in the music, they're playing music from another song in that music appropriation. But here the whole music is appropriated and reconstructed and by the shot design, and it goes into this kind of the music being rock and roll aesthetic, not always matching the image. And you have to be careful here because the music doesn't always match the image, but that it takes a representation of a scene and plugs it thematically with the music, whether it's for or against its point, is what we're talking about. So the representation The appropriation of the music in the representation of the matching moving images, is very important to interlay in your Tarantino notebook this semester, because you're going to have to go back to it and say, like, well, I remember these perfectly, but I got to write them down because it reminds me of where this comes in the movie or that. You can pretty go from Little Green Bag to Stuck in the Middle with You as like the introct. And that's where it comes on that like it's halfway through, and that's where we get another cue that it's like theatrical play. So, what is it to be a theatrical play? Well, all the characters got to be modern method actors. And you're like, okay, well, so they're playing psychologically what they should play. They might have ridden around as a gangster to get some. And you're always thinking in the background, like, oh, this is a true story. They all got into gangster shiznit. One thing that's surprising was Harvey Keitel was in this movie even after he was killed in Taxi Driver. So I don't know how that happened. I don't know how they bring people back from the dead in Hollywood. They kill them and then they bring them back from the dead, and they're very mysterious. I don't know what they do. It's not prayer, but they didn't teach me that trick. They kicked me out of film school before I learned that trick. No, I'm teasing. I did learn that trick, but I'm not telling any one of you how to do it. But these films by Tarantino, we can remember all of them. And one thing I was going to talk about, the consistency of filmmaking, is that one thing you got to realize is we go all the way back to Tarantino's first film in 1993, and it's Reservoir Dogs, and then you go to 2019, and it's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and we've kind of just paused there until Tarantino has gone on to make this movie about this film critic, which is what he told Elvis Mitchell, that it was going to be about a playwright, and a playwright was going to write like a story, or it's a movie critic. It's a movie critic in like a play almost. And so whether it's in the works still, I'm not sure. I'd heard a few things about it, but I don't know. I'm not going to cut on any of that turf because I never know about the new stuff. I just wait. Usually I try to tap myself out of it so I can finally see it without a bias. Like, that's the Roger Ebert thing. You completely tap out of the movie, you go do something else, and then you come back to it, and then you can write critically on the movie. And politically, I don't really know because it's postmodern, so anything goes. And but there's a lot of shot cuts too between how it moves around and how like the shot reverse shot in the interview sections are all timed well. And the philosophy of a Tarantino film is existential, and that comes from Scorsese and Bresson and their connection with the existential world, and that they're all dying and they're facing their mortality is postmodern in the anything goes way, but it's still like, we're gonna miss these guys because, man, they were badasses for a while. And even though it's all coming down to this end, and then again I'm talking 1993, so his first movie we pushed back to see it, and then his last movie we pushed forward, but it's still going back in a few years of time. So we've got a few more things to talk about with Reservoir Dogs. Important that they're all wearing suit and tie. Important that they're all Mr. Pink, Mr. Green, they assign colors to the characters' names, and that's how they determine who everybody is. And they in their motivations, they find that they want the briefcase full of money, they want the guns, they want everything to keep being gangsters and gangster life. But then you're starting to get this picture of like how Tarantino must ride around with these guys and like really do gangster stuff. And you get this feeling, like this almost paranoia that it's coming true before your eyes. Like again in Taxi Driver when Harvey Keitel gets shot by Robert De Niro. Like he shoots him and then he's like, and it looks so real and it's done so urbane and gritty. But this existentialism deal with mortality is important to note, because in mortality we find meaninglessness because it's nothingness, and nothingness seems to have no meaning. But when we are destroyed, we stop suffering, but we also stop breathing. So we're neither suffering nor breathing. So what does that mean? That we're in the pangs of meaninglessness or nothingness, in the grips of a reality of existentialism, that nothing is going to work. There's no metaphysics, there's no God. All it is man, and the long timer goes off until his death, or the short timer goes off until his death. And then once he's gone, that's it. There's no more. I mean, we still have memories of people here, but once they're gone, they're no more, and they can't think of memories of us, unless they're ghosts. And Tarantino doesn't really tell ghost stories, and that's kind of why Scorsese and doesn't tell ghost stories, and Bresson doesn't tell ghost stories. Because they don't really they believe in ghosts, maybe like Shining style, but they don't like, and they may talk to ghosts all the time. I don't know. They're superpowers, directors, but they don't have ghosts in their film because I think the reason is because they realized ghosts were invisible. And I'm just kind of teasing you, but no, it's no metaphysics. It's like the supernatural, even though there's divine intervention in Pulp Fiction, okay? I'll give you the divine intervention in Pulp Fiction article. So, the mortality that leads to dread, thinking about the days that you will be no longer breathing, but no longer thinking because you'll be dead, is kind of what these movies remind us of, because at one hair trigger pin drop, you can see the mortality collide with a character you got to know and got to like, and then he's down. He's morally ambiguous, so I still like him for his good qualities, but now he's down and dead, and this is going to reflect on the rest of the movie, and it's down to like the last three guys, and they're all shooting. All you hear when it tracks out and goes away is the gunshots going off. Now, my theory about the title, Reservoir Dogs, it could come from Straw Dogs. And Straw is one way, is a Peckinpah film, and there's some Peckinpah in these Tarantino films. The action, the Don Siegel, like, gun to the head type thing. And Dirty Harry, with his big old pistol. But in Reservoir Dogs, it could be from Straw Dogs. Reservoir, I'm not sure. Straw reservoir, we get water out of a reservoir, we get straw to eat meals. I don't know. Straw Dogs was kind of the point of that, was like they're made of straw, but they have to be, they are who they are, but that they're total vicious dogs. And in the Reservoir Dogs, there's this whole flashback that happens in the middle of the kind of theatrical setting in the garage, and that is where there's this whole bathroom lit up, and these cops are coming in to like beat up some dude, and one guy kind of watches them, and they make some joke about the Reservoir Dogs, and it's just unplain, like, hard to assimilate joke about the Reservoir Dogs, and that they were these dogs that would like run after you if you were committing a crime and like knock you down or something, but they weren't like canine unit or anything. I didn't really, but the reservoir is like the water and the straw is like the plant. I don't know. I swear it comes from, it's some kind of postmodern analogy of Straw Dogs. But that there's no real violence towards women is kind of suitable in that one, because there may be a couple of shots of females in that, but there's hardly any females in that movie, and it's because that's the way Tarantino wanted to start it off, is like not have it be like this thing where the female enters and with her femme fatale characteristics takes over the double indemnity action of the film. And we'll see this in the scripts, like True Romance, Natural Born Killers, of these guys that are like, they live by night. And there's other movies too from back then, like there's other movies from back in the day, Fury, Gun Crazy, You Only Live Once. I mean, these were all movies that had to do with guys and girls on the run, and they would love the romance couple on the run, having to do the gangster stuff while robbing banks. Bonnie and Clyde. I mean, we see this up till True Romance. There's Wild at Heart. There's so many good versions of that story. And only the great directors have pulled it off to big sleep, And so now we got the film noir crossing over into it, and Reservoir Dogs kind of does remind me of a film noir. It's like their suits are dark, the silhouettes are bright against these dark colors coming in, and I just remember that garage every time it lifts, like there's some kind of wild shot in there, and it's like he's using this garage to film the whole movie. And I think if you've got to make a movie and you've got that cast, you could make it like a Reservoir Dogs type movie, but no one can really imitate Tarantino because he's so original and crafty. And I'm saying it comes from other films, but it's original how you piece those films together. And I'm not saying that like he only pieces old films or old plays together. Like when he goes back, he envisions a scene, and most directors really envision a scene from another movie when they're shooting a scene to theirs. That way they can match up in their head what they're trying to achieve. And it's not really even copying, it's more like homage or pastiche. And pastiche is just like parody without the comedy. It's like, I'm going to show you a scene from Richard III, and you do it, and then you just move on. So, we have 5 minutes left, maybe even 6 or 7 minutes, and I'm going to start slowly wrapping up because we've got a lot to talk about this semester. There's 16 classes, there's 10 movies. I'm not quite done talking about Reservoir Dogs, but I'll come back to it as we go because we have a lot of ground to cover. I mean, we have, Pulp Fiction, which is going to take like 3 lectures. And then later there's some Glorious Bastards, and there's Grindhouse, and there's, Hateful Eight. We'll take a look at our favorite parts and what make them our favorite parts, but also what we like about the movies and why comes from what the director's intention was to be in his superstar eccentricity, to make something that was controversial in a postmodern way, not to offend anyone personally, but this could happen, So the postmodern contextualization is usually that appropriation with that representation. And the representation, if it's in a context of, say race, class, and gender, then the representation could get problematic with the way it tends to be out of shape with the American character towards that. Like if you were to take a liberal cosmopolitan ideology, and you wouldn't have any problem with the racial spheres of multiculturalism, but some of the tendencies of these mafia movies and other movies of the past is that there's this racial characteristic in the film. That Reservoir Dogs, again, with the women and the racial factor and even somewhat the class structure, because they're also interested in this bag of money at the end of the rainbow type thing. And so you get back to the theatrical realism. You go in, you say all your lines, but when you're marking your script, and that's when you're going through your script looking for your lines, marking next to the ones that are your lines. You want to write in the margins what your character is doing when he's not in the scene. And so like Tarantino is using these theatrical techniques to make it, and now he wants to do a theater play after his next movie, and I'm like, he can do anything he wants. He's one of those directors that if he wants to be a puppeteer tomorrow, he could be, whether John Malkovich is or not, I don't know. But we'll get to Pulp Fiction a little bit next time. There's a few other movies I haven't mentioned, like, for instance, Kill Bill 1 and 2. And I think that's counted as a single movie. And although it's 2 movies, we count it as one because Grindhouse only counts as one, even though it's Robert Rodriguez does the other half in Planet Terror. And his Tarantino's is Death Proof. And there's Django Unchained and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I think we've talked about all of them. Jackie Brown, and that's on this. Lawrence Bender threesome. And I remember seeing them both in interviews after they'd done that show so long, and after they'd got their Reservoir Dogs film in the can, and after they had to reshoot it again for like the Hollywood release, and how like they even had to reshoot certain parts again because the film would break, or when they were using real film stock, it was a lot costlier. And when you're an independent director and you're using film stock, there's a lot more. You have to be like a scientist on the set, otherwise the emulsions won't even blow, the halides won't blow, you won't get a picture that shows up in the background and immersively comes forward when processed. You can't even check it on the set. When processed, you find out what the scenes look like, and you're like basically directing a Fellini movie in a garage, It's like, but I feel that we've come far today. I feel that we can grasp an understanding of this mythology of existentialism and pain and loneliness and how those things happen, but you can't lose your cool. Those things happen. Death even comes from the nothingness and meaningless. But if you lose your cool in the grips, if you lose your cool in the grips of meaninglessness, existentialism, nothingness, then you never had your cool anyway, because that's when you need your cool most. And how the cinema of cool makes meaning, I like. It makes meaning with those contrapuntal sounds, the soundtracks that go against the image you're seeing, stuck in the middle with you. And the slasher, like Tarantino said, it wasn't originally how he intended it. Or how the original singer intended it, excuse me. His little, his stuck in the middle with you wasn't exactly how he intended it to be remembered, but everyone that hears that song ever remembers that scene where the dude's getting his ear slashed. And it's almost like, what is that? Like Van Gogh's assistant? Who are they mailing that ear to? So, we'll talk more with you next time. I think that it's probably a good idea that I end class here and let you off a couple minutes early, but we're not really early. We're just getting there on good time. So everyone be well. Welcome back to Masterclass. The wait is over. The semester's ready. We've got a lot more to talk about, and I'll be more specific about the actors and scenes coming soon, but these movies you absolutely should see, and that Pulp Fiction book by Dana Poland, I'm almost requiring you to pick it up. In fact, I am requiring you to pick that up and share your receipt to Coursera. We need to buy books for these courses, man, and get on some kind of a scholarship to pay for the class, man. That's what I'd be telling you if I was like getting you to the financial aid office or something. Well, here's a scholarship you can sign up for. Anyway, all right. Have a good day, and we'll see you next time. Masterclass.